100 người đã ghi danh nhưng mà đã hết chỗ. Thành ra những người đó thì phải là chịu khó là quay qua Facebook Live. Thành ra thưa quý vị, cái phần tọa đàm sẽ được thực hiện bằng tiếng Anh. Vì vậy khi tọa đàm bắt đầu, chúng tôi xin mời quý vị muốn nghe bằng tiếng Việt, xin quý vị tìm cái nút nhấn ở phía dưới cái màn hình có cái chữ Interpretation và chọn tiếng Việt. Nếu mà quý vị muốn nghe bằng tiếng Anh, xin quý vị nhấn nút Interpretation phía dưới màn hình và chọn cái sinh ngữ là English cho tiếng Anh. Chúng tôi xin mời quý vị thử để mà bảo đảm quý vị có thể nghe được cái phần tiếng Việt hoặc là phần tiếng Anh trước khi mà chương trình tọa đàm bắt đầu. Thưa quý vị, cái chương trình tọa đàm hôm nay chúng ta sẽ có 3 diễn giả và sau khi 3 diễn giả đã trình bày thì chúng ta sẽ có phần hỏi đáp. Nếu mà quý vị có những câu hỏi, xin quý vị cho vào chat box và chúng tôi sẽ có người thu thập tất cả các câu hỏi của quý vị để mà chúng ta có thể hỏi đến các diễn giả sau cái phần trình bày của họ. Và vì thời gian hạn hẹp, nếu mà diễn giả không trả lời được những câu hỏi của quý vị trong chương trình hôm nay thì chúng tôi sẽ post những cái câu hỏi đó cùng với câu trả lời qua Facebook. Thành ra quý vị có thể theo dõi Facebook của chúng tôi tại VBI Global. Và trước khi chúng ta bắt đầu vào chương trình tọa đàm, chúng tôi xin mời chị Khoa Trang, thành viên của Board of Directors của VBI Global. Xin mời chị Khoa Trang với đôi lời giới thiệu về VBI Global. Xin mời chị.
Dạ vâng, cảm ơn chị Liệu rất là nhiều. Xin chào tất cả các anh chị. Một lần nữa, chào mừng các anh chị đã tham dự chương trình webinar do VBI tổ chức với chủ đề nhập khẩu vào Mỹ, những thách thức và giải pháp cho doanh nghiệp Việt. Và Trang đầu tiên thì Trang xin thông tin một số thông tin tổng quan về VBI Global. Trang xin share màn hình các anh chị. Yeah. Dạ vâng, VBI Global là một tổ chức toàn cầu kết nối người Việt về kinh doanh và đầu tư. VBI Global là tổ chức trung lập, phi chính trị, phi tôn giáo và tổ chức đăng ký pháp nhân công ty không chia lợi nhuận có trụ sở tại tiểu bang Texas, Hoa Kỳ. Thành viên của VBI Global đó là những người Việt làm kinh doanh và đầu tư. Thành viên cam kết tham gia, kết nối, học tập hàng tuần để cùng nhau nâng tầm lãnh đạo, uy tín và chất lượng cuộc sống cộng đồng người Việt trên toàn cầu. Thành viên của VBI Global làm việc hoạt động dựa trên 4 giá trị cốt lõi như sau. Thứ nhất là sự uy tín, là chúng tôi tạo ra một môi trường tin cậy có chọn lọc, đặt uy tín và cam kết cho từng thành viên. Chúng tôi cam kết uy tín về chất lượng sản phẩm và dịch vụ mà mình cung cấp. Và chúng tôi cam kết uy tín về mối quan hệ mà mình chia sẻ. Giá trị cốt lõi thứ hai là sự hợp tác. Chúng tôi luôn luôn lắng nghe và tương trợ vì mục tiêu chung để phát triển nhanh hơn và xa hơn. Chúng tôi luôn có thái độ tích cực về chia sẻ, xây dựng mối quan hệ sâu sắc và bền vững. Giá trị cốt lõi thứ ba đó là thái độ học tập và không ngừng học hỏi. VBI Global tạo ra một môi trường học tập và học hỏi để trao đổi những kiến thức, kỹ năng, trải nghiệm cho từng thành viên. Và giá trị cốt lõi cuối cùng đó là hạnh phúc và thịnh vượng. Chúng tôi mong muốn đem tới hạnh phúc và thịnh vượng cho từng cá nhân, cho doanh nghiệp, góp phần tạo nên sự hạnh phúc và thịnh vượng cho cộng đồng người Việt trên toàn cầu. Và tiếp theo, Trang xin giới thiệu về ban lãnh đạo của VBI Global. Đầu tiên đó là anh Vinh Nguyễn, chủ tịch của VBI Global. Hiện tại anh đang sinh sống và làm việc ở Virginia. Tiếp theo đó là Tran. Tran hiện tại giữ chức vụ phó chủ tịch phụ trách vận hành và Tran đang làm việc và sinh sống tại San Diego, California. Anh Đinh Bảo Anh, phó chủ tịch phụ trách về phát triển và thành viên về công nghệ. Anh đang sinh sống và làm việc ở Alabama. Và cuối cùng đó là anh Đinh Bảo Lâm, Ngô Bảo Lâm. Anh là chánh văn phòng. Anh đang sinh sống và làm việc ở Texas, Houston, Texas. Các anh chị có thể tìm hiểu thêm về VBI Global và theo dõi các hoạt động của VBI Global theo trang web hoặc là Facebook của chúng tôi. Website thì tại vbiglobal.org và Facebook thì facebook.com /VBI Global. Và tiếp theo là Trang xin giới thiệu về các anh chị về một chương trình mà sắp tới diễn ra tại Houston, Texas vào tháng 4 này do VBI Global tổ chức. Sorry các anh chị. Vâng, đây là chương trình của VBI Global. Đây là một chương trình Conference and Expo với tên gọi là Transformation to Success, chuyển đổi để thành công. Đây là một cái chương trình xúc tiến thương mại đầu tư, là cầu nối giao thương giữa các doanh nghiệp sản xuất, cung ứng dịch vụ với các đối tác và những khách hàng tiềm năng. Expo lần này thì VBI Global thu hút và quy tụ được các doanh nghiệp, các cá nhân có nhu cầu tìm kiếm nguồn cung ứng, sự hợp tác, xuất nhập khẩu đến từ các tiểu bang khác nhau, từ Hoa Kỳ, đến từ Việt Nam hoặc là đến từ các nước trên thế giới. Expo sẽ có khoảng là 200 công ty tham gia trưng bày với giới thiệu sản phẩm, khoảng là 2.000 nhà đầu tư và khách tham quan ngày Expo. Cùng với sự góp mặt của các hiệp hội doanh nhân, các cơ quan xúc tiến thương mại Hoa Kỳ, các diễn giả nổi tiếng và các cơ quan đầu tư tài chính Hoa Kỳ. Trang nhắc lại một lần nữa là tổ chức chương trình Conference and Expo được tổ chức vào ngày thứ Sáu, 21 tháng 4 năm 2023. Các anh chị, quý anh chị có thể tham gia dưới 3 dạng. Thứ nhất là chúng ta có thể tham gia bàn trưng bày, booth trưng bày để giới thiệu sản phẩm. Các anh chị có thể tham quan, tham dự vào Expo, hoặc là các anh chị có thể tham gia vào gala dinner, hoặc là các anh chị thấy đây là một cái chương trình mà tiềm năng đối với các doanh nghiệp của các anh chị, thì các anh chị có thể tham gia tài trợ cho chương trình. Và tất cả các thông tin và đường link đăng ký để tham gia Conference and Expo thì các anh chị có thể vào website của VBI Global, đó là WorldCraft vbiglobal.org các anh chị ha. Và một lần nữa cảm ơn các anh chị rất là nhiều. Trang xin dừng lại ở đây và chuyển lời lại cho chị Liễu. Xin cảm ơn các anh chị.
Cảm ơn chị Khoa Trang rất là nhiều. Và tiếp theo chương trình chúng tôi xin giới thiệu cùng quý vị Chủ tịch của VBI Global, anh Vinh Nguyễn. Xin mời anh Vinh.
Vâng, cảm ơn chị Liễu đã giới thiệu. Kính chào quý anh chị. Thay mặt cho tất cả hội viên của VBI Global, chúng tôi xin chào đón các anh chị doanh nhân tham dự buổi tối hòa đàm hôm nay tối ở Mỹ nhưng mà sáng ở Việt Nam. Đây là cái buổi tọa đàm trong quý 1 của VBI Global. Chúng tôi mong các anh chị thu nhận được những thông tin hữu ích và thực dụng qua buổi trình bày của các chuyên gia dày kinh nghiệm trong ngành xuất nhập khẩu. Nhân đây tôi cũng xin chân thành cảm ơn các diễn giả tham gia sẵn lòng chia sẻ kiến thức, chuyên ngành cũng như kinh nghiệm. Chúng tôi cảm ơn công ty REGISTRAR CORP đã tài trợ cho chương trình webinar hôm nay. Những tài trợ như thế này tạo điều kiện cho VBI Global tiếp tục mang đến những chương trình có giá trị. Chúng tôi mong quý anh chị tiếp tục theo dõi, phổ biến và ủng hộ các hoạt động của VBI Global để chúng ta có thể giúp phần đóng góp xây dựng hữu hiệu cho cộng đồng kinh tế của người Việt. Thưa các anh chị, VBI Global họp trực tuyến vào thứ Tư đầu tháng và thứ Tư của tuần, thứ Ba của mỗi tháng. Rất mong quý anh chị tham dự cùng VBI Global và các doanh nhân người Việt khắp nơi trên thế giới. Để bắt đầu buổi tọa đàm hôm nay, tôi xin nhường lời lại cho người điều hợp chương trình là chị Liễu Nguyễn. Xin mời chị.
Dạ, vâng, xin cảm ơn anh Vinh. Và thưa quý vị, Hoa Kỳ là một cái nhà nhập khẩu lớn nhất thế giới. Hàng hóa nhập khẩu đóng một cái vai trò quan trọng trong nền kinh tế của Hoa Kỳ và cuộc sống của người dân của Mỹ hàng ngày. Thì theo thống kê, nhập khẩu của Hoa Kỳ có giá trị tầm 3,31 nghìn tỷ đô vào năm 2022. Đây là con số khủng và con số này cho chúng ta thấy rất là nhiều cơ hội rất là lớn cho doanh nghiệp Việt ở khắp nơi trên thế giới. Và thưa quý vị, cái thống kê của United Nations Country Database về thương mại quốc tế cho biết trong năm 2022, Mỹ đã nhập từ Trung Quốc tầm 576 tỷ đô Từ Mễ Tây Cơ tức là Mexico tầm 459 tỷ đô. Từ Canada tầm 447 tỷ đô. Từ Nhật tầm 154 tỷ đô. Từ Đức 150 tỷ đô. Và Việt Nam đứng thứ 6, 136 tỷ đô. Từ Hàn Quốc là kế tiếp là năm thứ 7 là 121 tỷ đô. Sau đó là Ấn Độ, vân vân. Thì trong quá trình mà nhập hàng vào Mỹ, có rất là nhiều doanh nghiệp Việt tại Mỹ cũng như là những cái doanh nghiệp tại các quốc gia khác nhập hàng vào Mỹ thì gặp phải những cái vấn đề khó khăn, như ví dụ như là bị phạt rất là nhiều, bị hàng bị trả về, hoặc là bị liệt kê vào danh sách sổ đen của FDA. Thì vậy chúng ta là những cái doanh nghiệp, chúng ta cần phải làm gì để tránh những cái rủi ro vừa nêu ra? Thì người Mỹ người ta có một cái ngụ ngôn, người ta thường nói rằng là nghĩ đến chất lượng, tức là think quality, làm đúng ngay lần đầu tiên, vì nhiều khi chúng ta sẽ không có cơ hội lần thứ hai. Thì trong kinh doanh chúng ta cũng biết, ai cũng đều biết là khi hàng chúng ta bị trễ, bị không thực hiện được đúng hợp đồng thì chúng ta sẽ gặp rất là nhiều khó khăn. Ví dụ như là trong quá trình chúng ta bị tốn kém thêm rất là nhiều chi phí, và đôi khi có những công ty đã gặp phải vấn đề mà đến phá sản. Thành ra nhưng đối với chúng tôi, tức là đây là tất cả mà rủi ro đều có thể tránh được và giảm thiểu được nếu mà chúng ta theo quy trình đúng ngay từ ban đầu. Dù có thể cực hơn một tí hoặc là ban đầu mắc tiền hơn một chút, nhưng về sau thì doanh nghiệp sẽ đỡ bị nhức đầu, đỡ tốn kém và chi phí không đáng, phải gặp phải những cái chi phí mà không đáng tốn, hoặc là không có bị mất hợp đồng. Thành thưa quý vị, đây là cái lý do cho cuộc tọa đàm của chúng ta hôm nay với những chia sẻ của các chuyên gia trong ngành xuất nhập khẩu. Và xin quý vị cùng chúng tôi chào đón chuyên gia đầu tiên, đó là bà Anna Benevente của công ty REGISTRAR Corp. Bà chuyên lo về sản phẩm, nhãn trên các sản phẩm và đánh giá thành phần nguyên liệu. Anna, please switch to original mode, click on share file and you are on.
Hi, good morning and good evening, everyone. Yes, I'm Anna Benevente. I'm a senior regulatory specialist with REGISTRAR Corp. We are a firm that specializes in US FDA compliance. And as Ms. Liu said, it can be very difficult to export to the United States. There are some hurdles, and I know that the two other speakers and I are certainly here to help you along the way to try and smooth that path so that you can have a successful and uneventful exportation to the United States. We all have our areas of expertise and are excited to share them with you today. I'll go ahead and pull up, hopefully without any technical issues. Let me pull up my presentation. Okay. All right, thank you again for the invitation to speak today. I'll be talking about the US FDA regulations for exporting food to the United States. I'm going to cover some of the general requirements that everybody should know about, but it can be more specific, and I encourage anyone with questions to reach out. We have a 24-hour chat line where we man it and answer questions just to anybody who dials in, just about general questions on how to make sure that you can export successfully to the US. Okay, this particular overview, I'm going to cover the basic requirements, being the food facility registration, prior notice, the food canning establishment registration and requirements, labeling requirements, food safety, and then also, of course, take any questions that you all may have. Okay. So first and foremost, we'll talk about the basic FDA requirements, and these will apply to any firm that is exporting food or supplements to the United States. Okay. First and foremost, you will need to have a food facility registration. This is required under the Bioterrorism Act of 2002 for any facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or store food. This includes beverages and dietary supplements. Foreign facilities are also required to designate a U.S. agent. This is someone who is physically within the United States who can act as a communications link between that firm and the U.S. FDA. They will also receive any sort of communications from FDA regarding inspections and similar matters. And this registration also must be renewed biennially on the even year. If it's not reviewed successfully, then FDA will cancel the registration So you will want to make sure that you stay up to date on this. FDA will cancel them without notice. They just did it a couple of weeks ago, from what I understand. And so often companies will ship not realizing the registration has been canceled. And they don't discover it until the ship arrives in the port of Los Angeles and it's not being allowed to enter US commerce. So it's an important detail to understand. Also important to understand that by registering your firm, you are consenting to inspection by the US FDA. So they do foreign inspections routinely. And so if you want to make sure that your registration stays intact, you will need to be prepared for an inspection by the US FDA. It also requires what FDA calls a unique facility identifier. At this point in time, the only UFI that is currently recognized by FDA is a Dun & Bradstreet number. Dun & Bradstreet is a firm that will verify the address and the identity of companies and issue them numbers. And so FDA expects this to be part of the food facility registration. There are some exemptions from the registration requirement. So trading companies who don't actually take possession of the food and just arrange for its exportation do not have to register. Personal residences, any companies that are simply doing transport, farms, retail food establishments, fishing vessels, and then also USDA regulated facilities. So for example, if you are shipping catfish, your product falls under USDA, not FDA, and then you would not do the FDA registration. Prior notice is a requirement for individual shipments being sent to the United States. It is a notification that is filed with FDA, and it is required even if you are just sending samples and not a commercial entry per se. It can cause a problem because there may be a detention import if it's not filed. And it must include information about the shipment and the facility that it's coming from. It may be filed by an exporter, an importer, or by a third party. So for example, if you have a consultant or your US agent in the United States, that person can file the prior notice for you. There are some time requirements as well. So you must submit the prior notice at least 2 hours before the shipment's arrival by road, 4 hours before the shipment's arrival by rail, 4 hours and if it's arriving by air, 8 hours if arriving by water, and before it is shipped if you're sending it by international mail. Now, certain products are going to be subject to additional requirements. Primarily, the most important one is the food canning establishment registration and a submission identifier. What we call FCE and SID are requirements for acidified foods and low acid canned foods. And so these are products that have been treated so that they are shelf stable. I usually will use the salsa example to try and illustrate this. So for example, you have salsa that is made fresh, kept under refrigeration, and sold while still refrigerated. It is not shelf stable. So that product is not an FCE product. However, if you have heat treated it, canned it, put it in a jar, it's now shelf stable, it will last for years. This is an FCE product. And so it will need to go through extra registration and product submission requirements. So the facility that manufactures the product will have to register. And then there is an SID submission where you send in to FDA your process and you describe the process by which it's been treated so that FDA knows that it will not become contaminated while on the shelf. Now, this is often a common cause of detention. So this is something, if you have a canned or bottled food, something like green olives in brine, artichokes, figs in syrup, roasted peppers, olive oils that have additional ingredients, you will want to make sure that you have this filing completed. So these are some typical products, aseptic packaging, applesauce, sliced peaches in a can, canned tuna, canned sauces, things that have been acidified or treated so that they are shelf stable. Now, if you're curious about whether or not your products fall under this or are have already been filed, excuse me, we have these tools that you can use online to see whether or not your products are subject to these requirements or if a SID has been filed for them. Now, food labeling is something that often people don't think about, but it's a very important part of the process. Excuse me. And so it's important that you have your labeling in hand and fixed before you send products to the United States. This is another common cause for detention. These are the pieces of information that will need to be on your packaging, and it will need to be in English. You will need to have a statement of identity, which identifies the nature of the product by its common name, a net quantity statement, usually grams and ounces or fluid ounces and milliliters or liters, a complete ingredients list that names each individual ingredient found in the product. If your product has any of the 9 major food allergens that FDA has identified, those need to be declared in an allergen statement. Also, the identity of the manufacturer, packer, or distributor, along with the corporate name and address, a country of origin statement per customs requirements, additional languages. If you have any additional language, non-English language, you will need to repeat all of this information in that language as well. And then unless you're exempted, you will need to have our nutrition facts panel, which is unique and not found anywhere else in the world. This is what they look like. So there are different formats depending on the nature of the product and the size of the packaging. So for example, you see to the left our standard chart. In the middle, you see what are called the small package, tabular, and the linear, which are permitted on smaller packages. And then to the right, a simplified chart, which is used for products that do not have a significant number of nutrient values in the product. So sodas, oils, water, things like that. There's also a new requirement from the USDA that may impact your product, the bioengineered food disclosure. And so this is a requirement that USDA has established for certain foods and food ingredients that are subject to disclosure requirements. And so foods or products containing these foods must disclose the presence of bioengineering on the label using one of the options that's allowed by USDA. They have a list of foods that are commonly considered bioengineered, like corn and soy. And so you'll need to use this symbol or a similar statement on the label. Also, if you have actual knowledge that your food has a bioengineered ingredient, then that needs to be declared on the label as well. Organic foods are becoming a larger and larger part of the market. This claim is also regulated by the USDA, even if it's on an FDA regulated food. And so they have requirements. There are 4 ways that a food can be labeled as organic. So if a product is made with 100% organic ingredients, you may claim that it's 100% organic. Products made with at least 95% organic may use the USDA organic seal and the term organic. Products that are between 70 to 95% organic may use the phrase made with organic, and then you insert the names of the ingredients. And then products made with less than 70% organic ingredients may only disclose the individual organic ingredients in the ingredient statement. Also important to know, you must have your products certified organic by a company that is recognized by USDA and accredited as an organic certifying agent. Now, in the last decade or so, FDA has been issuing new food safety requirements as a result of the Food Safety Modernization Act that came out in 2011. So you will need to make sure, if you are a manufacturer shipping products to the US, that you're in line with these new requirements. So this is sort of a high level. It can get much more detailed. If you have questions, I encourage you to reach out. We have really good information on our website about food safety requirements. But generally speaking, the manufacturers need to have a food safety plan that incorporates hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. So this is a step above HACCP, and so it has a few other elements to it that FDA has deemed necessary. You know, this is a plan that's going to have hazard analysis, verification, corrective action, record keeping. It's a very comprehensive, food safety plan that needs to be put into place. And this plan has to be written by what is termed a preventive controls qualified individual. So this is someone with the education and experience necessary to come up with a food safety plan under the HARP-C requirements. Now, there are some exemptions and some modified requirements. For example, retail establishments like restaurants and stores may not be subject to this. Very small businesses are called qualified facilities. They have an attestation process that they can go through to be considered exempt. Also, juice and seafood products that are being manufactured under HACCP will be exempt from these requirements. Also, alcoholic beverages, dietary supplements, because they have stricter GMPs than conventional foods and beverages do, those will be exempt. USDA products, because they're subject to inspection upon entry, farms, and then also unexposed packaged food in warehouses. There's also new requirements for importers. So if there are any importers on this, you need to know that you are subject to what is called the Foreign Supplier Verification Program. And the FSVP importer is named in the customs entry. And what this program is FDA decided that importers needed to be more cognizant of the foods that they were bringing in, and ensuring that they were coming from suppliers who were in compliance with FDA's requirements. And so importers now must monitor their suppliers for FDA compliance and ensure that they are in compliance with FDA's food safety regulations. Then they also have to have an FSVP plan that is written by a qualified individual that includes the process by which they evaluate and approve suppliers and then also conduct verification activities. So you will need to keep track of your suppliers and make sure that they aren't having problems with FDA, like import refusals or bad inspections and things like that. Now, the plans are usually going to have to be product and facility specific. So there are some important questions that importers often ask, such as how will FDA enforce this? So importers need to know that the FDA will conduct audits. They also inspect facilities. So they will come to the importer's place of business and conduct an inspection, ask to see the FSVP plan, ask to see all of the records associated with it. They also do it in port, where they will have inspections, and if the importer cannot show an FSVP plan, then the products are detained and refused entry. They also issue warning letters. And so the consequences of non-compliance for the importers are significant. Import alerts, detentions and refusals in port. They can suspend the registration of the manufacturer. They can also file civil and criminal charges. And so there can be a lot of collateral damage to the company. For example, warning letters are published on the FDA's website. They never take them down. So even if you resolve it, if anybody searches for your company, they may find it. So as Ms. Liu said, it's important to get everything, properly done before you start exporting to the US, so you can avoid these types of problems. Okay, so just a quick note how we can help. Registrar Corp has solutions that may be able to assist you. We assist with all of the requirements that I have talked about so far today. And so we're happy to help in any way possible. With that, I'll just go ahead and conclude. And thank you again for the opportunity to speak to you today.
Thank you so much, Anna, for a very informative presentation. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions for you later on, and we'll do that at the end after everyone has the opportunity to speak. And now please join me to welcome our second speaker. And our second speaker is Jimmy Tran, who's the CEO of WorldCraft Logistics. And Jimmy, please make sure that you are in the original mode, share the file, and you are on.
Hello, how are you doing today? Good morning from Vietnam. Good morning in Vietnam and good evening in the US. Let me share my screen. Second. Share. Give me 1 second. Sorry about that. Okay, my name is Jimmy Tran. I'm the owner of WorldCraft Logistics and also the CEO. So today I want to thank everyone for having me here today. I left Vietnam when I was 9. I never thought that one day I'd be here to connect the business between Vietnam and the US and help everyone, help people import cargo and company into the US. A little about our company. Our company, we have an office in Vietnam and we have an office in the US and China. Our company has been expanding in the last 10 years, and we have chassis for the port. Due to COVID, we have invested in our own chassis, our own truck, and our own warehouse. The point of our company doing this is to make sure that the supply chain has been, stabilized for our client through the COVID or whatever situation our clients go through. So I know that a lot of people here have been importing and exporting. So I just want to go over the general process of transportation. So normally for an exporter or importer, your shipment is being manufactured or you purchase from the manufacturer. It goes from the manufacturer, it goes to a truck, and from the truck, it goes onto a vessel or airplane. And then by then it gets transported to the US or another country. And from then it cleared through US Customs, FDA, and then once the shipment is released, it gets transferred and it goes to a buyer warehouse or a distributor. So that's the general rule of transportation. So our meeting, our agenda today is 3 ways to improve your process between Vietnam and the US, because a lot of people are very concerned about the process between Vietnam shipping to the US, especially food, because the US have a lot of regulation. However, as long as we do our homework, as long as we communicate with the right people, the process could be very easy. And then important keys, and then conclusion. So let's talk about how much shipment goes between Vietnam and the US. So in 1 year, in 2022, Vietnam exported $127 billion between Vietnam and the US. So there's a lot of business between Vietnam and the US. And because of that, companies should explore to work with the US. Three ways to improve import process between Vietnam and the US. So popular products that go between Vietnam and the US. So I list 3 products that's popular between Vietnam and the US. Number 1 is furniture. Number 2 is fruit. And number 3 is seafood. So we're going to go over each product, what document is needed for each product. So for general cargo, normally to import general cargo into the US, you just need invoice, packing list, and if the product contain wood, for example, earlier our example was furniture. If the product do contain wood, then what we need is the Lacey Act. It's very easy paperwork to fill. Usually your freight forwarder able to fill that for you. But importing furniture and general cargo, very simple. Invoice, packing list, and if there's wood, then we have the Lacey Act to clear. Okay. Fruits. So fruit I would say fruit is one of the more difficult shipment. Majority of the time, fruit is being handled by air. It's time sensitive. Once you reach once the fruit reaches the U.S., we have to clear the shipment through USDA. Before that, there's also overseas inspection certificate, phytosanitary certificate, USDA. Register earlier, Anna pointed out this registration for the factory level and also the importer level using the DUN number. And depending on the type of fruits, you would need 2 or 3 additional documents for the type of fruits. Seafood. So seafood is pretty much the same thing. Invoice, packing list. Seafood, I would say seafood is more of a more difficult shipment that get imported. Again, FDA, certificate of origin. However, then you have to work with the fish and wildlife. Tuna have a quota and anchovy. So for the type of seafood that before you import to the US, we recommend that you talk to a broker, a freight forwarder, or a specialist in the US before you import in a shipment. And you also need 2 to 3 additional documents for the type of fish. So now we're going to go over 3 important keys. Earlier, Anna pointed out that the quality is very important. For us, we handle hundreds and hundreds of shipments per year for our clients. And I want to go over the quality control. Every shipment that being imported into the US, there need to be a quality control. I would say I would recommend 100% quality control. It's because this is your first line of defense. This is the last time you see your shipment before it leaves the country of origin. This is pretty much your only chance to make sure if there is any problem, your shipment get fixed or it get fixed, right? So our first case study, this is happened recently about 3 months ago. We have a client who import in sugarcane from Vietnam to the US. Mainly sugarcane, the type of sugarcane is being imported from Vietnam to the US to make sugarcane juice. So as the shipment left Vietnam and entered the US, it was tagged for exam. And when it was tagged for exam, the client, the farm or the factory in Vietnam, they failed to remove the knot on the sugarcane in the picture. They failed to remove it. And because they failed to remove it, the shipment was rejected. It's a reefer container. It stayed at the exam site for roughly about 30 days. It couldn't enter the US, and finally it got exported back to Vietnam. The cost for the damage is roughly about $24,000. It's sometimes this amount of money could put a company out of business, but the client fixed the problem, and now the client have another shipment of sugarcane imported back to the US. Everything is fine now, but what I'm trying to point out is quality control on your product is very, very important on the factory level. So now we have, next one is we have coil. So Vietnam is also one of the manufacturing of steel in Vietnam. So when you import a product, not only does the product inside of your shipment is important, right? Your packaging outside your product, or even the package that hold the product is important. And for this, you also need to spend time and put some quality control check in place. So we have a exporter of coil from Vietnam to the US, and they were using coil, and the wood that was used to hold the coil stable inside the container, it was fumigated. However, the quality control of the fumigation was very poor. It was one exporter from Vietnam shipping the shipment to 3 importers in the US, one in Seattle, one in Chicago, and one in the East Coast. So the container that arrived in the East Coast, one of the container was examined just to examine the coil, but in the process of examining the coil, the officer found out that the wood it have mold in it. And because the wood have mold in it, he stopped additional 3 containers. And when he stopped the additional 3 containers, they will all have mold in it. So then that company in Vietnam got blacklisted. So every single shipment that entered the US from Seattle all the way to Chicago, all those containers were stopped and examined. And it cost the company $158,000 for all those exams because they failed to do the packaging quality control. Some wood is not much to hold the package, but little small things matter so much with your packaging. The solution to this was we were able to negotiate with U.S. Customs 3 containers. Luckily, it was only 3 containers in the East Coast. So the coil were pulled out of the container. The wood that was holding the coil was put back into the container, and it was exported back to Vietnam. U.S. Customs are very picky, but quality control is also important at your factory level. Next, we have a case study. So factory level case study of the image of the company. I believe that why we worry about documentation, that's very important. The company also have to build the image of the company. Factory level, make sure that your factory is always ready. Image of the factory, image of your process, and how you market yourself is through your website, a global presence of your company. I would like to give an example of a product that a client bring in. So this also applies to fish, fruit, and furniture as well. So we have a client that would bring in toys to the US. The toys, large amount of toys in the US. The problem with him is that he could never understand why every time when he bring in toys, his toys always get examined, right? He couldn't figure it out. So what it is the problem with toys is that toys is number one, toys duty free, and mainly toys use 2HS code. So for US custom officer, when they look at a toy product, they just see the invoice, the packing list, the word is toy, and they just see a code, right? They look it up, they just see a code. Well, the problem with toys is that when a toy have one HS code, the toy could be for a toddler, right? The toy could be a toy gun, a fake toy knife. A toy could be a lot of things. So what my recommendation to the customer was that, number one, if for your packing list and for your invoice, if you could put the pictures of the toy on your invoice and packing list, the model number of your toy on your invoice and packing list. Because what a lot of people don't know is that US Customs, when you bring in product, US Customs actually care and actually go to your website and look at your website, look at what kind of product you bring in. So for example, if a custom officer were to look at his toy and he get the model number and he go and he visit the importer website or exporter website, what they see is, okay, so what you have here in the invoice and packing list is a toy, but when the custom officer goes to your website, they will see what age group is it for, number one. Labeling is important, and I put that out earlier. What age group is it for? Number two is what kind of plastic it is, and warning labels. So also for your toy, not only the picture of the toy is needed, but because the box also have like warning label, like choking hazard label. So this also apply to bringing in a food product. Your website is a great tool for custom officer or your partner or your buyer from the US to know not only they buying a great product, what's inside the package, but also your factory, how do you process fish, food. Video is also very important. image is important, but also the labeling, the box, and the packaging. So branding, image of a brand is very important. Finally, communication. Communication is very important in your supply chain. Whenever you bring in new product into your supply chain, you should definitely communicate with your factory, depending you're the importer, exporter, your farm, your supply chain. So what it is, like I would like to give an example of what a lot of people run into when their business is doing so well in the US. So let's give an example of importing in rambutan. It's a fruit, exotic fruit from Vietnam. So what it is let's just say you sign a contract for air shipment to ship, let's say 1,000 kilo, all right, of rambutan to the US weekly. Okay, the product is being sold out very fast. Once the shipment lands, it's sold out instantly because it's such a popular product. Your farm performed very well. Your quality control is good. Your packaging is good. However, since the product is doing so well, your buyer in the US or your distributor in the US decide to say, hey, you know what? Instead of 1,000 kilo a week, you are doing so well, we would like to increase to 4,000 kilo per week. So this is when I see so many importers fail, is because once they increase production, let's just say for fruits or seafood, they start to outsource their production to other farms nearby. And when you start to outsource the additional supply from other farm or other vendor around, what happens is that you start to lose the quality control. You start to lose packaging control because now you might have to outsource the packaging. And this is when things start to go wrong, is when pretty much what happens is that you grew too fast, which is a good thing. However, controlled growth is what is important. So that's why communication for future growth. So people import in product too fast and grow too fast. And what happened is that the quality fall, right? Before, when I was buying the rambutan, it was really good. However, now a month later, I'm buying the same brand, and it doesn't taste the same. So what it is now, so how do we solve this, right? How do we solve this? My recommendation is have meetings with your supplier, if you're the middleman, have meeting with your buyer, and ask them, how's my product doing? Are you planning to increase your purchasing power? If you're increasing your purchase power, you need to give me some kind of a notice, like a 30-day notice or a 60 or 90-day notice. The Asian culture, we love to please our clients, and we don't like to say no. But sometimes, in order to keep the quality high, we have to say no. So what the best thing to do is communicate with your buyer and your supply chain and say, hey, if you are going to buy more product or increase your purchase from us, we need a 30-day notice, a 60-day notice, and a 90-day notice. It's always better to say no to control your quality versus saying yes and lower your quality. Lowering your quality not only have potential for you to lose client, but also potential, especially with food, is for you to get tagged by the FDA, to get blacklisted. It's something you do not want for your company. So that's communication. So conclusion. Number one, quality control. I've seen so much importer importing in their product, and over the year they start to lower their quality and just say, hey, that's fine. Quality control should be number one priority. It's something that you control at the factory level before it leaves Vietnam. The expense is not expensive as once the shipment reaches the US and it doesn't pass FDA or USDA and got to go back to Vietnam. When that point happens, you lose everything. At least with the quality control, you're able to control it at your factory level before it leaves, right? Company image, marketing, and trust. To grow in the US market, one need to have an international presence, an image of your company. Marketing your website. It's your company calling card. Are you investing money into building your website? Are you investing money into a video of how your fruit is being processed? Is how, you know, the process of your quality control? How are you processing your product to win the market? And the image and the marketing and the website is not only for potential buyer, but it's also for US government agency. They do visit your website. They will go to your website to see, is this company reliable? What is this company? Like, what is ABC company? They will visit your website. So you need to invest into your website and image and video so that it's easy. It's gonna help you clear custom. Overall, it's a win. And finally, communication with the supply chain. Freight forwarder, you always contact your freight forwarder. Majority of the shipment that I have dealt with that have problem is because the exporter from Vietnam and the importer in the US, they fail to reach out to us. It's a free service. They fail to reach out to us to ask what kind of document is needed. We as a service provider, we would love to communicate with you. We would love to give you the right answer, point you to the right path to make sure that you are successful, because when you are successful, we are successful. Because when we hit a problem and we have to solve a problem for you because the shipment is being rejected, those kind of problem solving take much longer than, you know, doing it right the first time. So in conclusion, be detailed. Importing into in the USA, personally been doing this for 15 years. I believe it's easy. Just work with the right people and be detailed, and it has to start at the factory level. And if you have any question, please feel free to contact me.
Yes, and we will do all the questions at the end. So again, thank you, Jimmy, for your presentation and the examples and the case studies as they help to put things into perspective. And so now, ladies and gentlemen, our third speaker, please join me to welcome Attorney Deborah Stern, specializing in imports and exports with Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg. Please make sure that you are in the original mode, share the file, and Attorney Stern, you are on.
Thank you so much, Lou, and thank you to Anna and Jimmy, both phenomenal presentations and actually teed mine up really well. I'm going to share my screen now. Make sure I get my slideshow mode going. With me. So I think the context of my presentation is very similar to what Anna and Jimmy both covered, which is you're in a much better position exporting from your point of origin if you know all of the requirements of the country you're importing, you're exporting to, because so many of them do fall on the factory or the vendor, even though the importer is ultimately responsible for compliance with US laws. There is a critical partnership that is both required for complying with the government rules, and there are so many and listed so many of the food safety rules, and that's just a small piece of the overall imports environment. So know before you go is my constant theme. And what do you as a vendor, and I know some of you are here in the US and probably importers as well. So what do you need to know on both sides of that transaction to make sure that your goods can come into the United States, clear customs, that you know what your costs are going to be, and hopefully avoid any very expensive surprises. Jimmy had some great examples of expensive surprises, and I'll have an anecdote or two myself as well. This is just our normal disclaimer. So I am an attorney, and I started my career at U.S. Customs and Border Protection more than 20 years ago. And I have been in private practice now for the last 17 years. And I can tell you, I haven't seen it all, but I've seen a whole lot. And our firm has a collection of folks. A lot of us came from the government. And so we see both sides of the compliance landscape. So importers and manufacturers, exporters, and we understand too, there may be multiple tiers in that supply chain, from factory to a middleman, maybe 2 or 3 middlemen, ultimately to the importer. And all of those parties will really benefit from understanding what the legal obligations are of the U.S. importer of record, because everybody in that supply chain will contribute to the U.S. importer being able to comply with all of our obligations. I always say I work in the alphabet soup of regulatory compliance: USDA, FDA, CBP, DOT. I mean, you name it, we have an acronym for all of our government agencies. And all of them have an incredible number of rules and regulations that govern various products. And I think what's so important to understand is that U.S. Customs is the face at the border, enforcing the laws of some 40 different agencies and probably over 400 laws and regulations. And they're not good at all of it. I'm sure anybody on the panel here can tell you, they don't always know exactly how to interpret and apply those regulations, and that's where we come in. Also important is understanding the costs of compliance. You know, what are the duty rates that your goods are subject to? And that's not just regular duty rates, what we call column 1 duty rates, but anti-dumping and countervailing duties, other trade remedies, also China 301 duties. Although you know most of you are looking at exporting Vietnamese products, some of them may have Chinese inputs, and the manufacturing processes may not be enough to convert those Chinese inputs, and U.S. Customs may deem it a Chinese product even if it was made in Vietnam. We'll talk about that in a moment. So it's important to understand before you finalize those contracts and sell those goods and get them to the United States, whether they're in fact going to be considered a Vietnamese origin product, and if they're going to be subject to any additional costs beyond the what we call regular duty rates. And then, of course, potential efficiencies that are available through compliance. There are so many cost-saving opportunities and duty mitigation strategies that are available, but they all come with a whole lot of rules. And so it's important for importers and exporters alike to identify all of the obligations and all of the opportunities before products leave point of origin. And so today we're going to cover a few of those requirements. I'm going to cover a lot of ground, and we only have so much time, so I'm going to do it at a high level. And if there's any topics I mention but I don't get into detail, please feel free to ask questions at the end, or of course to contact me later. So the kind of high level of our U.S. import requirements, again, we're talking about specific products. We're going to get into things like Anna covered today, but our what I call the core customs requirements are tariff classification, customs valuation, and country of origin and marking. There's also specific customs entry requirements. Jimmy was referencing some of those documents that are required for different products. Entry requirements are all about having the documents. Now, the system for filing those entries or declarations to customs is mostly electronic now. And so customs may not see all of those documents, but they have the power to ask for them. And it's very important that they have them and that they're filed correctly. In fact, when a customs broker who's normally going to file entries on behalf of an importer is filing that electronic entry, they're also uploading all of those required documents, whether it's a Federal Communications form for goods that have emit any sort of signal, or whether it's some of the FDA requirements. There's a form for anything that has a laser in it, even a barcode scanner. All sorts of forms. Again, Jimmy had some great examples there. And there's record keeping requirements. And again, these all technically fall to the importer of record, but so many of the record keeping that must be done are records that come from the point of origin. And so again, important that you, as for those of you who are exporters and factories, that you have or maintain the kinds of records, and that you cooperate with your importer when they call you and say, customs stop my shipment, I need your production records to prove that the product was actually made in your factory. And this happens, and I'm dealing with something just this week on this very issue, which I'll get into in a bit. There's customs bond requirements for the importer. And if you are a non-resident importer, which I will talk about that in a moment, you can be a non-resident importer, meaning a non-US entity. And you have customs bond requirements to help secure the duty payments and tax payments that are owed to the government. And those bond requirements have gotten pretty onerous these days because all of the insurance companies that issue the bonds, customs has to approve them, but it's private insurance companies that issue them. They are requiring a significant amount of collateral to back those bonds because they are just limiting as much risk as they can. So it can be very onerous on the importer. What we call partner government agency requirements, as Jimmy and Anna both alluded to, FDA, USDA, Environmental Protection Agency. There are the licenses for dairy goods, licenses and permits for agricultural products, label requirements. There's just so many. Like I said, 40 agencies and 400 laws and regulations are enforced at the border. There's your import security filing, what we call the 10+2. This relates to the prior notice that Anna was referring to. Customs has a similar requirement now. That is their data elements for before the goods are even laden onto a ship or plane. They call it the 24-hour rule. And then also there's intellectual property rights compliance. U.S. Customs enforces trademarks, copyrights, and certain patent protections. And those trademarks include certification marks like UL and ETL for electronic goods and for home appliances. So there are, customs is one of the few private rights that U.S. Customs enforces and does so with vigor. And the consequences of failing to comply are really significant. The U.S. Customs is a law enforcement agency, and they have a broad range of tools to use to ensure compliance. They can't inspect every shipment that comes in for every issue, but they do have very skilled, advanced data targeting that they use to select shipments for inspection, and they're very good at picking the things that look a little bit off, but they also may just randomly choose shipments to review. The consequences of failing to comply with customs laws fall under a number of there's a number of different penalty regimes, but the standard one is the failure to exercise reasonable care, which we'll get to in a moment, which is due diligence. Monetary penalties, again, on the importer can be 2, 4, or up to 8 times the value of underpaid duty. So if a product is subject to $100 in duties and they've made an error, they would owe not only the $100, but in a penalty situation, 200 more. And now imagine if you add several zeros to that, which is usually what happens. And customs has a 5-year statute of limitations, so they can go back to your to entries up to 5 years. So an error today could be something that had been repeated many times. And so, when you're looking at errors in the import declaration, those errors, again, can give rise not just to penalties for those current shipments, but actually potentially all the way back 5 years. And that can be really significant, especially if your product that you thought was going to be entered as a product of Vietnam ends up being deemed a product of China because of our China 301 duties and because of some very significant anti-dumping orders. Liquidated damages are also another form of consequence. These are basically fines, but they are specific to the bond. And a lot of the liquidated damages arise in the context of FDA, detentions, seizures, forfeitures, refusals, exclusions. These are all the types and import alerts, which again, that blacklist that everybody has mentioned. There is a way to get off of the blacklist in terms of the get import alert removal. But I think, as Anna mentioned, your name does stay on the list. You just may not have your product subject to import alert anymore if you go through a process. We help a number of clients get off of import alert. But these are all the types of controls that U.S. Customs enforces, and they can be really significant. Not to mention the demurrage charges that that the importer will have to deal with, or sometimes the exporter, depending upon the terms and who's responsible for clearance. I have today, in fact, we got a notice of detention. The product arrived in the United States on February 14th, and Customs did not issue a detention notice until March 29th. That's 6 weeks. Normally, that's not supposed to happen. Customs has 5 days to go through an intensive exam if they select a shipment for exam. And after 5 days, they must decide to release or the shipment is detained. So why did this one take 6 weeks? My best guess, because we're waiting for an answer from Customs, is that it was sitting at the port terminal and it just hadn't gotten to the inspection because it was designated for a hold before it ever arrived in the United States. But it just may have taken that long to get the product over to the inspection station, to get the container. And if that's the case, the demurrage charges are accruing significantly on that kind of situation, and it happens, unfortunately, way too often. I won't get into today. There is some recourse on unreasonable demurrage through the recent Ocean Shipping Reform Act, through our Federal Maritime Commission, another agency in the alphabet soup, the FMC. We won't talk about that today, but by and large, you have to expect that there will be demurrage charges if your product gets stopped for intensive exam. Penalties can often be mitigated through a petition process, and sometimes even canceled. And yes, Customs will issue penalties even when they're wrong. They just don't know they're wrong, and that's where we come in to help identify, provide all of the right information in the right form with the right legal citations to say, hey, Customs, you got this one wrong. But also, we spend a lot of time talking with our clients about prior disclosure, which is a way to avoid penalties by doing a self-audit and correcting all of the problems and tendering whatever revenue was lost to the government, the duties, taxes, and fees, and that can help avoid penalties. So I'm talking about these penalties for 2 times, 4 times the loss of revenue, and I mentioned reasonable care. What is reasonable care? Well, this is the principal obligation of a U.S. importer of record. It's to use reasonable care. This is a term of art to enter, classify, and determine the value of imported merchandise, and to provide any other information necessary to enable Customs to properly assess duties, collect accurate trade statistics, and determine whether any other applicable legal requirements are met. So all of those documents we were referring to before and that Jimmy gave us examples of, that's all part of this. The record keeping I mentioned, that's all part of this. Customs has the ability, not everything's going to be presented at the time of importation, but Customs has the ability to ask questions. And it's all part of the importer's obligation to answer those questions fully so that Customs can verify how they've declared the goods, is correct and compliant with any requirement that that particular merchandise is subject to. Reasonable care basically means due diligence, is just a different term for it. And as an importer, part of that due diligence is demonstrating that you know and understand what the requirements are for the products you're importing, as well as the import process, and also having procedures to ensure continuing compliance. When Jimmy mentioned quality control, it occurred to me it was a great terminology to use in the examples, but really also that quality control that allows your goods to come in is also compliance controls. And so when we talk about measures or procedures to ensure compliance, part of that is the quality control, knowing that, you know, your sugarcane can't have nubs on it, knowing that hazelnuts being imported from Pakistan need to be of a certain size. It's you know, again, each and every commodity may have a special rule that applies just to it. And it's the onus is, of course, not just on the importer, but on the exporter and farmer factory to make sure that those products comply with those US requirements. So as a practical matter, effectively communicating compliance needs with suppliers is critical. The manufacturer, supplier, or exporter is going to have better access to a lot of the information that an importer needs because they produce the goods or it's their supply chain. And as we talked about with Anna, there, you know, as a manufacturer vendor, you may be subject to facility registrations and requirements and have to have your food safety plans in place, supply chain verification, anti-dumping and countervailing duty investigations. US Customs has expanded authority and is using it, again with vigor, to investigate anti-dumping and countervailing duty evasion. They will come to Vietnam, they will go to Malaysia, they will go to Cambodia, wherever they believe that there may be evasion. As I say, there's lawful avoidance, which is these duty mitigation strategies I'll mention. And then there's unlawful evasion, which is, for example, when you know, a Chinese company whose products are subject to anti-dumping, let's use kitchen cabinets as an example. That's one of the projects I'm working on this week. They move their factory to Vietnam or Malaysia or somewhere else in the region. But they're using materials from China, or maybe they're not. But US Customs knows the name of the company. They see it in the supply chain. Again, that all that advanced data targeting. And they will come and look. Again, to Jimmy's point, making sure that you have a website and that you are showing off what it is you do does actually go a long way, because Customs can go, oh, that's a real factory. You know, that's a legitimate company. I can verify that they actually exist. And they're not, you know, a fly-by-night operation. U.S. Customs and actually back in the day when there were textile and apparel quotas, Customs would go and all around. Again, China's just a great example because they tend to have more of the compliance problems with the U.S. But they would go and visit the factories and find empty factories. I mean, this is, they still to this day, they will go look. And that's, of course, not anyone here. You wouldn't be here if you didn't, you know, if you were trying to evade the law. But it's important to know that the US government has the authority to come in and make sure that that what is being imported was actually made in the country that's being declared. So as I mentioned before, you know, again, part of that reasonable care, those requirements, any other information necessary, and that could be an accurate description of merchandise, proper invoice descriptions, and content to validate the HTS code, potential dumping and countervailing orders, understanding, providing enough information to Customs so that Customs can validate with its partner agency, the Department of Commerce, whether those cabinets are subject to a dumping order or countervailing order. qualifications, permits, validating country of origin. Again, I've gone through some of this before, but also well-supported claims for any sort of preferential duty treatment, claims under free trade agreements, first sale valuation, which is a program where you legitimately reduce your import value by using the factory to middleman price rather than middleman to importer price. We actually have the longest running and most robust first sale value program. And it's a program that's only available in the United States. No other customs administration allows first sale. And there's a number of other duty savings programs as well. All of those need to have strong controls in place to make sure that it's compliant with the rules. The programs are allowed, but you have to follow the rules to use them. And again, sometimes this means that the importer needs information from the vendor. And some of that information may be confidential. You may not want to supply it, but there are also ways to help protect confidential information, but still provide U.S. Customs what it needs to see in order to give the benefit to those goods coming in. I just want to kind of quickly cover, we have regulatory invoice requirements. Just your standard commercial invoice has to have all of these factors on it. And again, we won't go into detail, but the commercial invoice is critically important. And as important as making sure that the purchase price is consistent with what the importer has actually paid for those goods. We'll get into value in a moment as well. But I wanted to also point out that there are certain products that have certain invoicing requirements, like footwear, like aluminum, steel, textiles, chemicals. So it's not enough just to say what it is or even to have the government agency forms, but there may be specific invoice requirements as well. And also separately itemized rebates and discounts. Any discount given that needs to be negotiated prior to goods being imported into the United States, or the importer can't take those discounts. Now I want to just turn quickly to again, those kind of core, those core customs requirements. Again, the invoicing requirements are one of them. Tariff classification, which incidentally is probably the sweetest of my sweet spots, because I started my career at U.S. Customs headquarters doing tariff classification. Tariff classification, HTS code or HS code, as you may hear of it. It's not only important to assign the duty rate to your products, the regular duty rate, but it identifies whether your product is subject to a quota, visa, license, such as sugar or dairy. Sugar and dairy have quotas and licenses. Eligibility for special duty rates, both punitive and positive. So like Section 301 duties or free trade agreements, for example. It also signals potential application of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. However, ADD and CVD, as we call it, those are governed by the scope of the particular order and not by the classification. But your customs broker may say, oh, this HTS code is flagged for anti-dumping, is your product subject? And then the onus is on you to determine whether your product is subject. We have a very complicated anti-dumping and countervailing duty system, and it is not something that you can figure out on your own most of the time, because the language of the order also has other resources that help to interpret what how the Department of Commerce applies the order. And again, that's where counsel like myself and my colleagues come in. The correct tariff classification will help avoid delays in customs clearance. It is also a requirement in complying with the laws. And most importantly, for any good business, it helps ensure predictable transaction costs. Now, the correct classification requires, at a minimum, the composite material, the composition breakdown, product description, function, and use. And depending upon the product area, a number of other additional pieces of information about how the article is prepared or made may be necessary. And as a vendor, that information often must come from you, even if it's a confidential formula. And again, there's ways that we can use counsel or consultants to help shield some of that information from the importer if you as the exporter want to try to protect it. But if the tariff classification requires a piece of information like a percentage of content, and you don't want to give your formula, then your importer cannot correctly classify those goods. And that's going to be problematic for them and ultimately for the vendor. And it's important to know as well that the importer cannot rely solely on the exporter for that HTS determination. Part of its exercise of reasonable care is making sure that it has validated that a code provided by a vendor is accurate. Just quick example, particularly in the food and beverage, because I know we do have a number of food and beverage folks here. Any edible item, the provisions in the tariff for edible items require a lot of cross-referencing between different headings and different chapters in the tariff. And I do hours of training just on classification, so I'm trying to keep this really high level. But understand that composition breakdown, the type and impact of the processing, the use. Classification may require that you have a laboratory analysis done of the product, because guess what? U.S. Customs has its own lab and it will test the products itself if it needs the right information. But what's interesting is that sometimes U.S. Customs laboratory will use a different method than maybe you as a vendor used, or you had a third-party lab do. And then we have sometimes a conflict. And again, we usually can help come in and bridge the gap between that conflict of the two different standards, but Customs has a particular standard. So using the right third-party lab that knows the U.S. Customs required methods is very important. I get particularly for things like prepared or preserved vegetables, and same thing with fruits. There's a particular term in the tariff, prepared or preserved by vinegar or acetic acid. What Customs has determined, and you can only find this requirement in its rulings, not anywhere in the tariff, is that being preserved by vinegar or acetic acid to Customs means 0.5% or more. And so again, you need a laboratory analysis to determine if you have enough vinegar or acetic acid to be considered preserved that way or otherwise. And again, there's tariff differences, there's tariff rate differences, there may be quota differences depending upon, there may be dumping differences. Fruits, again, you've got pulp, dried, juice, residue, fish, fresh, frozen, chilled, dried, salted, brine, smoked. These are all different types of preparations, but they're all provided for in different headings of the tariff. So again, it's important to know and understand how those tariff provisions apply. Again, pulling another one of Jimmy's examples, toys. There are so many products that we think of as toys as consumers and as producers, that we think of as toys that are not classified as toys. And so it is important to make sure that that product description doesn't just say toy. Similarly, there should never be a product description, and we see it all the time, but I just encourage never to use spare parts, because again, there's no way to classify spare parts correctly. You have to know what the part is, because there are some very complicated rules to classifying parts of machines and parts of electronic devices.
Attorney Stern, we're gonna run out of time, so we need to.
Oh my goodness, my apologies. So Customs value, most important thing. Customs value is intended to capture the true value of a product. There are specific requirements in the law for how to value your products. And there are each of these issues: packing costs, selling commissions, assists, royalties, proceeds of subsequent resale. These are all additions to a transaction value that have to be included. So if, for example, assists, if you have a US importer supplying you fabric and you're making a suit and then sending it back, you can't just charge, you may only be charging the cost of the suit, but you also have to add in the value of the materials that you were provided by the importer. And so you may have your commercial invoice that your importer actually pays, but you also need to have a pro forma invoice or an invoice for customs purposes that has all the additions if they're not already built into the price. If you're related to your importer, that's going to trigger customs scrutiny. They're going to ask questions. They're going to make sure that if you have a relationship with your importer or with your vendor, that it qualifies as a bona fide sale and that transfer price qualifies as arm's length. Very complicated, lengthy rulings on what that means and how to apply it. We also have a reconciliation program, which I won't get into, but it's important to know that if you're related to your importer, you're going to have to make sure that you can qualify that transfer price as a legitimate price for customs purposes. Country of origin, I alluded to before, there are some very particular rules to apply in origin. It's required for your entry declaration. It's required for marking the goods properly. In the United States, we have very stringent marking rules. It's required for free trade agreements, quota visa restrictions, anti-dumping and countervailing duties. I put an asterisk there because AD and CVD rely in part on our substantial transformation test, which you may have heard of. But actually the Department of Commerce recently issued its own new regulations with its own standard for determining origin for dumping orders. It's important for government procurement and the trade agreements waivers. Vietnam, unfortunately, is not a country that is within our trade agreements waiver. But any improper origin claims can lead to detention, seizure, exclusion, and penalties. I'm not going to get into all of these again in the interest of time.
Yes, we have just maybe 1 minute for you to wrap up because you went way over already. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. The most important thing to understand here is the substantial transformation test is what applies to goods coming out of Vietnam in terms of the origin. And the test is named character and use. And value add is not a significant factor. And I mention that because I can't tell you how many factories I talk to and they say, but we put in 50% of the value. We put in 40% of the value. That's not a significant factor for determining origin. And again, I think you all have the slide so you can look a little bit back. I mentioned record keeping. We didn't get into forced labor and supply chain visibility, but this is really important right now because Customs actually just this week has started looking into shipments from Vietnam in US foreign trade zones. And what they're looking for is forced labor. Our new forced labor rules require importers be able to trace goods all the way back to raw materials. So it's important to understand that the US importer needs to have supply chain visibility all the way back, and they will ask you for vendor agreements. They will ask you for site visits. There's different ways to monitor. Supply chain controls and prevention are critically important these days because of forced labor, because of IUU, and also for origin verification. I already mentioned non-resident importer. Duty mitigation strategies is where we conclude. Lou, I think I made my minute.
All right. Thank you so much, Attorney Stern, for your presentation and the examples. It's very informative. And I greatly appreciate all of the speakers, your presentations with all the tips. I'm sure help answer many of the questions for our guests. However, there's still more questions. So right now, the next section we're going to reserve for the next 15, 20 minutes or so to go into the Q&A sessions. I've been able to collect some of the questions from the chat box. And there's the first question going to Anna from Sifan. And he said that are coffee and tea in retail package governed by the food canning established as well?
If the coffee and the tea are in dried form and therefore are shelf stable and will have a low water activity, they won't be subject to the FCE rules. However, if you're talking about a liquid product that's been canned, then the odds are pretty good that it's going to need to have the FCE and the SID met if it would not have been shelf stable without some sort of treatment being applied to it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And we have another question also for Anna, and it's from Khan Mong. How can we obtain USDA, FDA's approval labels in Vietnam? Anna, you're going to need to unmute. There you go.
Sorry, it didn't cooperate for a second. So in terms of labeling with FDA for foods and supplements, they do not approve labels, but they do expect you to have your product labels follow all their requirements. And this can be difficult because you may, in good faith, label your products and you don't discover until you bring them in and FDA inspects it and they say, nope, sorry, you didn't do this right. You're going to have to relabel or ship it back to Vietnam. USDA products. So in the case of Vietnam, I think that would be limited to catfish and the Salua forms. You know, is that a genus or an order? Whatever it is, I can't remember. Biology class was a long time ago. But you know, so for USDA regulated products, they have a generic approval process where, in essence, it's just follow the rules. But if you're making special claims about the product, then you may need to actually submit it for actual approval from the USDA. If you're bringing in something other than food or supplement, cosmetics do not have an approval process. Drugs require a registration and listing of the label, but there's not a label approval process per se, unless you're going through what's called the new drug application, similarly with medical devices. So the takeaway here is that for FDA, there generally isn't label approval per se. You just have to make sure that your labels are correct when you start shipping the products to the US.
Sounds good. And while we have these questions addressing to a particular speaker, please, the others, feel free to add, chime in if you have something to add to it.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to add that, and I'm sure Registrar Corp offers some services as well, but this is where, again, FDA counsel, trade counsel, and consultants can perform the label reviews, give you the guidance you need, and then, you know, provide you with a memo that again shows that you have done your due diligence and that the importer has done its due diligence to make sure those labels are correct, or as correct as they can be under the law, to the extent that it's, you know, clear and understandable.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah, it's also worth mentioning, if you do find that you've shipped the products and they've been detained for a labeling violation, at least with FDA, you can still petition for permission to relabel the products using what's called the 766 form. Mm-hmm. And so it's a headache, you know, it's not fun. You have to relabel it in port, you have to get permission from FDA to do it, then you relabel, then they come and inspect it again. So it's a hassle, but it might be preferable to then actually having to give up on that shipment and send it back. So if you do find yourself in a detention situation, you know, my team works on those all the time. And so I'm sure, you know, an attorney can help with that as well, or, you know, somebody can help you if you do find yourself in that situation.
Yeah, thank you. The next question, I guess this is kind of open. Maybe it's for Jimmy. It says they want to know why ideal distributors, importers should be in California, Texas, and New York. And I think that based on that is just logistically where the ocean line, the ports and the flights, they go in the most. That's where you would go to. But I'll leave that up to Jimmy to add on.
Yes. So the reason why you want distribution in California, somewhere in Texas, or the middle of the United States and the East Coast is for pretty much come down to distribution and also the ports. California port is number one, New York is second, and then, you know, in the middle, Chicago or Houston. It's logistically, it's going to save you money when you find warehouse and distribution in those three areas. So that's what I recommend.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Now, the next question is why importers have to bear all costs due to an accident on water? Why not the carrier?
That's an excellent question. It kind of falls in my wheelhouse. Whoever bears the risk of loss really depends upon the terms, the Incoterms that are chosen in the transaction between the exporter and the importer. And so, for example, if you're an exporter selling DDP to the United States, that's on you, the exporter. And if it is the carrier's fault, you may be able to make a claim against the carrier bond. However, there are a lot of protections against carriers. And generally speaking, risk of loss just falls on the contracting parties. But there are ways to make claims against carriers. And again, you would want to talk to an attorney about how to go about that if that occasion does happen.
Sounds good. Thank you. From Sifan again for Jimmy, can you brief some advices on exporting goods from the U.S. to Vietnam?
Yes.
All the way.
So exporting good. So exporting good from the U.S. to Vietnam, I would say it's easy. Deb, I would say importing good from Vietnam to U.S.
I'm not
is
sure.
complicated.
Well, it depends on what you're exporting and if it's controlled.
I agree.
But that's a whole other seminar.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's
But,
right.
from exporting good from U.S. to Vietnam is usually, I'll tell you, normally people export cars. Cars is just paperwork. There is no tax. Anything that export, there's really no tax going to Vietnam. From American point of view, we want to export. We want to encourage exportation. Other goods such as Ensure milk, Costco product, a lot of Vietnamese go to those locations and buy and export, and usually it's very easy. There's usually no customs search for exportation. I would say one customs search a year. U.S. customs are very easy with exportation since it's just an easy product. Invoice, packing list is all you need.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Sounds good. And the next question is from Mr. Leslie Swan from Saigon, Vietnam. And his question is, what precautions should be taken when exporting steel structures, prefabricated houses, buildings, tanks, and mechanical products to the U.S. market?
Oh, this is who
wants to take that one?
That's got a lot of legs to it. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Well, maybe we can take it apart. Let's start with exporting steel structures, prefabricated homes, buildings.
I would say, well, if it's from a logistics perspective, that's kind of on Jimmy in terms of, there are a number of controls and trade remedies on steel products. And so it depends on what the origin of the steel is, what it is. But again, I'm not sure if the question's coming from the kind of compliance perspective or the logistics perspective.
I think let's start with the compliance perspective, and then.
Can I give you an example of what he asked?
Uh-huh.
So I think his number one concern is the tax, the importation tax, right? We all worry about tax because tax is tax. I guess I don't want to say this, but I guess example is this. There's different classification for importing metal sheets and garage door.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah, well, the classification of steel structures versus if you break it all down, you may be actually importing a bunch of steel tubes or things that are considered steel profiles that are going to be subject to very particular requirements for tariff classification in terms of, and you need a mill certification for all of these steel products. You need the composition breakdown from the mill. You may be subject to our additional steel 232 duties on top of regular duties. But if it does actually qualify as a structure, it's not going to be subject to those extra duties. So this becomes a question of classification and trade remedies. Again, as much as it does of how, again, how you're breaking it down, how you're importing it. And that's one of the things when I mentioned the mitigation strategies that we do is we look at both operational and tariff engineering. How can you ship it in the most preferable way?
Yes.
Yeah, gotcha. Yeah. Very good. Very good. Now, what about, we talked about mechanical. I think that's all together. You had already answered that question. So this question is for Attorney Stern. What is the best way to classify the products? I mean, we talked about you need all these information. Me being the logistic, I was in it for like 17 years and I left it so many years ago, thank goodness. but there's so many, so much going into a product, and to be able to classify it, obviously from the importer perspective, they want to pay the least amount of duties, taxes. But when, let's say at the start of the process, how do they start that process to say, okay, Mr. Custom, what's my duty on this product? Can you kind of go through that real quickly?
Well, I quickly no, but what I can tell you is I have a tariff classification 101, basically how to classify webinar. And I would be happy, and Lou, we can work this out. I'd be happy to provide a discount code for any of the participants that are here today to take. We have it on demand. It's on our website. I'll do a fresh one soon. And it actually walks you through the process of how to classify. And then, of course, getting help, whether it's a customs broker, a consultant, or an attorney. Our classification system and process and our level, the interpretation is complicated. The text of the tariff is not the whole story, and even how to use the tariff itself is complex. And we have rulings that provide additional interpretation. We have case law provides additional interpretation. So ultimately, I would say, if you want to try to work on learning and understanding classification, take my webinar. It literally teaches you step by step how to do it. But to get it right, you want to also consult the experts.
Sounds good.
My recommendation for that one is take the webinar to learn, but I recommend don't classify your own stuff. Just go to a custom broker.
Right, just don't.
Please do that.
Yeah.
Please do that.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then for Anna, do all products require FDA approval to enter the US?
No. So that's also kind of part of the challenge. The challenge is that for most products, there's no formal FDA approval process. However, for foods and supplements, for example, even though the product itself can't be approved, you still have to ensure that all of your ingredients are either approved as food additives or generally recognized as safe. If you have a dietary supplement, then what's called the dietary ingredient, kind of the point of the whole supplement, may be subject to what's called the new dietary ingredient notification requirement. So there's still a lot of legal things you need to check, regulatory matters to be checked. Claims, is such a huge part of it too. You can have a perfectly legitimate collagen supplement, but the moment you say it's going to repair the tissues in your knees, then now all of a sudden it's a drug, and FDA has stopped it, and they won't let you relabel it, and it's a mess. So, performing a regulatory review of your product before you send it can be a big deal. Colors are always an issue. So color additives are one of those things where FDA, it's black and white. They're either approved or they're not. And so if you have a color, even if it's perfectly safe, if it's not on FDA's approved list for the right type of product, then they're going to stop it. And there's no way to fix that import. You can't relabel a product that has an illegal ingredient in it. So yeah, being very careful with the products that you send and making sure that they're not just labeled properly, but that the formulation meets FDA's requirements is critically important too.
Very good.
Can I give an example of that?
Sure.
During COVID, when manufacture of masks in Vietnam were to be shipped to the US, mask is just a mask. It's not FDA regulated. Agree? However, there's people start putting things like block COVID, block germs. That's when it's FDA regulated. So that's a good example. Product is not, but the label that you create will cause the product to be FDA regulated.
Very good. Thank you. This question is a very particular question for a certain product. It's asked, the person asked, could you please tell me which are the legal requirements certificate for bird nest products in order to import into the US and how to apply them? And I think what they're referring to, bird nest, is like something that they eat or something like that, cooked. And so maybe one of you can help answer that.
And I can take a stab at it.
You know what that is? I can explain that one to you.
I do know what, I assume you mean like bird's nest soup type.
Yes.
And so we have reviewed those in the past, and so they would be treated as food, of course, and have to have the normal food labeling requirements, the nutrition facts panel, all that information from my slide. But then I know that there are also USDA permitting requirements. I don't know off the top of my head exactly what they are, but I know in the past I've seen that because it's an agricultural product, there was some sort of sanitary certificate, or maybe the importer needed a VS permit or something along those lines. So if you're looking to ship bird's nest, then you want to make sure that you've checked both FDA and USDA to see what the requirements might be.
Sounds good. Thank you. And this one is for Anna also. What is the difference between FDA registration and FDA approval?
So the registration is just as, basically simply registering your facility. It's required for, at this point, foods and supplements and drugs and medical devices. A new law was passed in December, where by the end of the year, cosmetic companies will also have to register in some cases and also do product listings in some cases. So registration is just kind of, that's it, registration. There really isn't FDA approval for most products other than certain medical devices and certain drug products do go through an approval process. But by and large, most products don't have an actual formal approval process through FDA. Again, you're just expected to know the labeling and the formulation requirements. And if you don't, when it arrives in port, then you've got a problem.
Yeah, exactly. All right. And then there's another question here, and maybe Jimmy can help answer this. Is there training support for Vietnamese person to become customs broker in order to help Vietnamese companies import, export to the US? Talk to Jimmy.
Training.
Jimmy, you can share.
I would say being a custom broker is as the test to become a custom broker is as hard as being a lawyer here in the US. There's rules that probably know that change because product change constantly, right? I guess it's so hard that for a Vietnamese person to get training, I would recommend that you kind of work under a custom broker for a year and then you finally take your test and then you become a custom broker. But to get training for a Vietnamese person in Vietnam, it's doable. Nothing is impossible, but I mean it's a free. Just ask for a custom broker and have them get the code for you. That's what I.
But also, I would just add to that though. I mean, and we have customs broker training courses. There's also customs brokers and freight forwarder associations all over the country. And there's a national customs brokers and freight forwarder association that provides support and help for the customs brokerage community and training. However, to be a US licensed customs broker, there are a number of stringent requirements. And I think one of them is that you do have to be here. So you can take a customs broker training course, but I don't know that, again, to Jimmy's point, I think you're better off working with a broker and again, taking the training course. And again, if you're here in the US and if you want to study for the exam and take it, great. It is very hard to pass. Training courses are needed. But if you're based in Vietnam and you just want to have an understanding of the process, again, there are courses to take, but unless you're planning on taking the exam, you may not.
It's not allowed.
Yeah, I think Annie's based in Seattle. That was the question from Annie, and she's based in Seattle. So
okay, so yeah, you can certainly do that. There are a number of training courses out there, but again, as Jimmy suggested, working with a broker, doing data entry and entry filing and really learning the process. And then taking some time to sit down and train.
We are running tight on time, but I'm trying to squeeze in 2 or 3 more questions before we go. So there is one question from Mr. Chi from Vietnam, and he said that from Vietnam, I would like to ship my product to the US. My product is pool thermostat, which is used for fish aquarium use. Is there any special import regulation to import to the US, or it will just treat as a normal product?
Generally, that's going to be a normal product. The only thing you might be subject to are the NIST standards for any weights and measures. Sorry, that's the National Institute of Standards.
Yeah.
And then is there something regulation on mercury? Like mercury cannot be used anymore, just in case. Sorry. Is there a regulation on mercury from a thermostat? Like mercury are not allowed anymore?
Oh, mercury levels.
Yeah.
You know what? I don't happen to know offhand, but there probably is.
Yeah.
Okay. So then and if that's the case, so that be considered as dangerous goods?
Yes, mercury is
dangerous
material. Good. I
Yeah.
think the US banned the use of mercury already. We're not allowed to use thermostat even at home anymore. So if he's going to create thermostat for the fish tank, make sure there's no mercury. We don't want any more mercury in the water either, right?
Mr. Chi, before you export that stuff from Vietnam to the US, make sure you work with somebody who knows the material to make sure before you ship it. Otherwise, it might get stuck in customs and you're going to get stuck with a lot of fines, penalties, and a lot of expenses that if you don't plan for it. Okay. And then we also have another question here from Bitwin from K Products. We have food retort products ready to cook, eat packages, which contains meat and bone broth. Can I export to the US? Is there any special requirements? Anybody want to
Yes
take a
and yes. Any food product will have special requirements.
Yes.
And depending upon which food product that will dictate and how it's prepared will dictate what the requirements are. You know, meat products, generally speaking, are the subject of the USDA's Food Safety Inspection Service. But I don't happen to know offhand if packaged ready to eat is subject to FSIS or just the standard FDA requirements. But again, any of these specific product questions would be great questions to send us, you know, separately, and we can talk about how to help you work with that particular product.
Sounds good. Okay, so I'm going to try to squeeze one more question. Is what type of certificate licenses for, you know, importing wines into the U.S.? I'm sure there's a whole lot of stuff there, but or alcohol, drinks that have alcoholic beverages. So
TTB, that is the Tobacco Tax and Tobacco Service. It used to be called something else, and that's why I always get thrown off. TTB is the agency that regulates the importation of alcohol, and wine in particular has labeling requirements. There's also complexities about distributing alcohol throughout the United States. I happen to have a wonderful resource who specializes just in alcohol and wine that I'm more than happy to share. I refer all that stuff to him because there's just only so many agencies I want to deal with.
Okay. And I want to recap one thing that you had mentioned earlier, Attorney Stern, that for the people who participated tonight, that you would allow them to give the commodity that they wanted to import so that you can help them classify, correct?
I will provide a discount code for the classification webinar. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So I will send that to you, Lou, and then you can distribute that. VBI can distribute that to the group.
Thank you very much. Okay, now we're going to conclude the Q&A right now, as much as we want to go more because we still have more questions, but we'll send that to all of you, and maybe you can help us provide the responses via Facebook so that we can make sure we get all the answers to our viewers today. So thank you so much, and I'm going to switch my mode to speaking in Vietnamese. So thank you. Thưa quý anh chị, chúng ta vừa kết thúc phần câu hỏi và trả lời của tọa đàm ngày hôm nay. Cũng còn một số câu hỏi mà chưa có được hỏi, tại vì chúng ta bị cái thời gian nó rất là hạn hẹp. Thành ra chúng tôi sẽ thu thập những cái câu hỏi đó và chúng tôi sẽ đưa lên Facebook, và những cái người diễn giả của chúng ta ngày hôm nay sẽ trả lời cho quý vị qua Facebook. Vì vậy quý vị nên chịu khó vào cái Facebook page của VBI, và cái Facebook page của VBI là VBI Global. Và chúng ta vừa kết thúc phần câu hỏi và trả lời của tọa đàm ngày hôm nay. Thưa quý anh chị, nếu mà anh chị thấy cái chương trình mà có giá trị và muốn tìm hiểu thêm về VBI Global, chúng tôi xin mời quý anh chị tham dự cuộc họp với VBI Global. Mỗi tháng chúng tôi có họp trực tuyến vào thứ Tư đầu tháng và thứ Tư tuần thứ 3 của mỗi tháng. Và mỗi quý thì chúng tôi có tổ chức một cái hội thảo trực tuyến như ngày hôm nay. Và một năm thì chúng tôi họp mặt 2 lần offline, tức là chúng ta đi đến một nơi và gặp mặt nhau, chứ không có qua Zoom nữa. Thì một năm là 2 lần chúng tôi có cái chương trình như vậy. Thì cái chương trình sắp tới như lúc nãy quý vị đã nghe ngay từ ban đầu, tức là ngày 21 tháng 4 là thứ Sáu tại Houston, Texas, chúng tôi sẽ có một cái conference và expo, và cái tựa đề của cái conference đó là chuyển hóa để thành công, tức là thay đổi để mà thành công, transformation for success. Thì chúng tôi, nếu mà quý vị có nhu cầu và muốn tham gia, muốn tìm hiểu thêm, thì quý vị có thể bỏ contact của quý vị ở trong chat box, hoặc là follow up với chúng tôi qua VBI conference.vbi.global để mà chúng tôi có thể giúp giải đáp thêm những câu hỏi cho quý vị, hoặc là lấy thêm thông tin từ đó. Nếu mà quý vị thích cái chương trình ngày hôm nay và thích tìm hiểu thêm thì chúng tôi như một lần nữa quý vị có thể bỏ cái tên vào trong chat box, thông tin liên lạc, số điện thoại và email để chúng tôi có thể reach out to quý vị. Và một lần nữa chúng tôi xin cảm ơn tất cả những cái speakers của ngày hôm nay đã bỏ thời gian và đã đến với chúng ta chia sẻ những cái kinh nghiệm và những cái phần chuyên môn của họ để chia sẻ với chúng ta ở đây ngày hôm nay. Và nếu mà một lần nữa, nếu mà quý vị cần thêm thông tin thì quý vị cứ bỏ vào chat box và những cái câu hỏi của quý vị sẽ được tất cả đều được trả lời. Và trong tương lai nếu mà quý vị có những câu hỏi gì thì cứ vào trong VBI Global Facebook để mà chúng ta có thể tương tác, để chúng tôi có thể giúp quý vị tìm những cái câu hỏi, những cái câu trả lời cho quý vị. Và thưa quý vị, đến đây chúng tôi xin kết thúc chương trình của buổi hội thảo trực tiếp VBI Global với cái đề tài nhập khẩu vào Mỹ, những thách thức và giải pháp cho doanh nghiệp Việt. Và một lần nữa chúng tôi cảm ơn công ty REGISTRAR CORP đã tài trợ cho chương trình ngày hôm nay. Và chúng tôi xin kính chào và hẹn quý vị vào trong những chương trình kế tiếp. Xin cảm ơn.